Okay, so as all the other classes have been, this week is in memory of Billy Mizrahi, Alav Shalom Yitzhak ben Bahia, donated by his son Gary, of course, one of the founders of the shul. So today we start with a new topic. We finished the topic of Muktzeh, and now we move on to another major topic in Shabbat, in the laws of Shabbat, and that is what we call the melacha, the one of the 39 labors that is prohibited, called hotza'ah, which is literally taking out. Sometimes in English we like to call it carrying on Shabbat. So this is just like Muktzeh was, an area that is extensive and complicated and has lots of different pieces to it. So we'll explain it little by little. It's going to take us a week, or so, or a little bit more probably, to go through all the different aspects of it, including one of the things that we know is a major issue, which is the concept of an eruv. How does an eruv work? When do we have it? What could we rely upon, and so on and so forth. Morning, IG. How are you?
Right. How are you?
Good to see
Sorry,
you.
just got home from shul. Just walked in. How you doing?
No problem. Good to see
How's
you.
Sammy?
He's good. He's first night is not an easy one, but he's recovering. Thank God. The recipient got the kidney. It took hold.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
Good.
Beautiful.
Mitzvah completed.
What a
Big
mitzvah.
Big mitzvah, and hopefully we'll get him home tomorrow. That's the goal. We'll see how it goes.
Amen.
Shlomo ben Rachel. Okay. So in order to understand the concept of carrying, you have to understand that not all places are the same, right? And that's like one of the key components. In order to understand the concept of carrying, we explain and we understand that there's four different what we'll call domains, 4 different types of areas that could exist in order for the purpose of applying the law of carrying or hotza'ah. So the first step before you can even understand how one carries is to understand the 4 different domains, okay? So what are the 4 domains? One is known as Reshut Hayachid. The word Reshut means a domain. So Reshut Hayachid means the domain of an individual. Reshut Harabim means the domain of the public, right? Reshut means domain, Rabim, many, the public. A Carmelit, we're going to explain, is something that's kind of middle ground. It's neither Reshut HaYachid or Reshut Harabim. And then there's Makom Petur. Makom Petur means a place that is a place that's Patur. Patur means exempt. We're going to have to talk about each one of the 4 categories. Hopefully we'll be able to explain each one today. But the 2 primary ones are the Reshut HaYachid, the domain that belongs to an individual or that is relevant to an individual. Reshut Harabim is a domain that kind of belongs to or is relevant to the public, a public domain. And those are the 2 primary ones. We'll start with those. So Ezehu Reshut HaYachid. So what is considered a domain of an individual? Makom hamukaf mechitzot gebohot 10 tfachim or yoter. Says so it's a place that there's a couple of different possibilities. Well, we'll start the basic category, that it is surrounded by walls that are higher than 10 tefachim. We know a tefach is a handbreadth, right, which he translates to here 80 centimeters, which in English, which in our measurements is about 32 inches, right? So you need walls that are about 32 inches high, which is not very high, right? If you're thinking about a 6 foot tall person, right? So 30 inches is midway, right? So 32, figuring it's waist high, right? It's not a particularly high fence. Some people, when they use tfachim, might use a different measure, but let's say it's between 30 and 38 inches, somewhere like that is the height of the wall. So it's an area that's surrounded by walls that are at least 38 inches high, right, or 32 inches high. ויש בו שטח של שיעור 4 טפחים על 4 טפחים. and it encloses these walls, which are that height, enclose an area that is 4 tfachim by 4 tfachim. Again, an area of 4 by 4 tfachim, which ends up being, he says 32 centimeters by 32 centimeters, which ends up being, what did we calculate? 32 divided by 2.54. I'll tell you in a second. I did the math a couple of minutes ago, but I forgot it. About a little bit more than 12 inches, about 12 and a half inches by 12 and a half inches. So a little more than a foot by a foot, which is not very large, right? A pretty small enclosed area. So it doesn't have to be very big, and it has to be enclosed by the wall. So if it has that space, then it's going to be Reshut Hayachid, right? Which many things could fit into that category. If I have, obviously simple places like a house, an apartment, a building are almost always going to fit into the Reshut Hayachid because they're going to have walls taller than 32 inches, right? And they're going to have space more than a foot by a foot, right? So those are easy, right? But even outdoor spaces, right? A fenced-in area, right? A fenced-in area could definitely fit into that category, right? A foot by a foot is not a very large space, and a fence that's 32 inches high is not a particularly high fence. So pretty easy to find areas that fit into this category. Another area that might fit into this category is a car, right? A car, certainly is tall enough, and it has, it's enclosed, and it certainly has that space and that height. So that would be something. Lots of other possibilities of what you consider a Reshut Hayachid. Okay, he says, but not only something that's enclosed in that way. He says, v'chen, or he says, so too a pit. Right? If you have a hole in the ground, he says, she'umko asarat tfachim. If the depth is 10 tfachim, which again, it's about 32 inches deep, right? So holes, that's a big hole, but okay, it's not so crazy to find a hole of that size, and it has the area of what we're talking about. So not only is it an enclosed area, but if it's actually a depressed area, right, into the ground, so that could be something. He says, v'chen tel. He says, so too, a mound of dirt, right? Let's say you have tel is like Tel Aviv, right, is a mound of dirt. He says, if the mound of dirt has a height above the area around it that's 10 tfachim high, and it's got space on the top, it's a big mound of dirt, but that it's got more than a foot by a foot on the top of it, then that becomes its own Reshut Hayachid, right? So all those individual places become Reshut Hayachid. Is that pretty clear? We didn't say it's owned by one person. It just means it's a place that's, because it's enclosed, it's no longer appropriate for the public, right? It's a closed off area by some measure. So many things can be a Reshut Hayachid. A balcony, right, hanging off a building, right, is definitely Reshut Hayachid because it usually has a fence of that height, and it usually has an area of that amount. So even though it's outside, the balcony is Reshut Hayachid. Okay? Any questions on Reshut Hayachid so far? Okay, yeah, good. So now let's go to the second type of Reshut, the second type of domain, and that is a public domain. Now, a public domain is going to be different than Reshut Hayachid. So let's talk about it. Ezehu Reshut Rabim, what is considered a public domain? Rechovot, streets, ushvakim, marketplaces, rechavim shesh esre ama, that are they are 16 ama wide. Now, how much is 16 ama? Basically, a little more than 25 feet. Right? If they have a width of 25 feet, ve'enam mekorim, and they don't have a covering, right? They don't have a ceiling or a canopy or something like that. Ve'en lahem choma, and they don't have walls around it, right? If they have walls around it, then it's not a reshut harabim, right? It's a reshut hayachid, as we just said, right? So it's got to be wide, right? It's got to be 25 feet wide, which, truth be told, is about the size of a Brooklyn street, right? A Brooklyn street width-wise is about 25 feet wide, and it can't be covered, and it can't have a wall around it. He says, "Vafilu yesh lahem choma." He says, and even if they have a wall, it could still be a reshut harabim. Im hem mefulashim mesha'ar l'sha'ar. If they are, you could go all the way through it from one end to the other. It's an open space. So even if there's walls on two sides, it's a lane, but if you could get from one to the other straight, from one side to the other without interruption, then it could still be the reshut harabim. So it could even be walled. He says, "Vafilu she'en ovrim bo shishim ribo." You don't have to have a certain number of people passing through it on a given day. Shishim ribo is about 600,000 people. He says this is what you consider reshut harabim. If the street is wide, it's reshut harabim. So that's the basic idea of reshut harabim. We're going to see there's a different concept. So now, what would fit into reshut harabim? For us, a street would definitely be, according to this opinion and this way of explaining it, a street is definitely 25 feet wide. Our streets are maybe even more than 25 feet wide, especially if they have multiple lanes, and especially if you count the area that, the sidewalk and potentially even if you don't have a fenced-in area, the lawns and the spaces leading up to buildings, if those are not fenced in, so then those kind of get contributed to it. So a lot of the areas that are outside in the street or something like that would be considered a public domain under what we're talking about here. Those would all be considered. Those things would be a public domain. Now, what would not be a public domain? Let's say you have a shopping mall, right? A shopping mall, is it's a pretty big, wide area. A lot of people could pass through it, but since it's covered, so then it would not be considered a reshut harabim. So it's got to be outside, right? Not covered, not walled in, and even if it's walled in, it can't. If it's walled in, but it's got like a straight shot from one end to the other, where you could get in and out, kind of like a doorway on each side, right? So then it would still be the reshut harabim. That's the standard opinion of how we explain a public area, a public domain. However, there's a major dispute on one point that we mentioned, and that's what we're going to talk about now. He says, Yesh omrim. There are those who say, Shim en shishim ribo ovrim bo b'chol yom eno reshut harabim. There are some who say, if you don't have 600,000 people passing through it on a given day, then it is not a reshut harabim. Then it is not a public domain. So that's a big difference, right? That last criterion that we put in as to whether or not it needs 600,000 or not, that's a major, major difference, because, if I take, East 7th Street in Brooklyn, right? So it fits the criteria of being 25 feet wide. It is not walled in. It does not, it does not have a roof over it, but it does not have 600,000 people passing on a given day either, right? So according to the first opinion, it's a public domain. According to the second opinion, right, it is not a public domain. It's got to be something else. It's not 600,000, right? So again, I'm going to just turn my computer around, right, and you're going to see my street, right? My street over here that I live on, right, there's no walls around it. It does not have a ceiling over it, but it also doesn't have 600,000 people passing through it on a given day. So the question is that street, which is like many streets that we know, is that street at Reshut Harabim or not? According to the first opinion, it would seem like it's a Reshut Harabim. According to the second opinion, it is not a Reshut Harabim. Right? So knowing that there's these two opinions of what consists of a Reshut Harabim is a very significant fact. It's going to be very, very important for us, especially when we want to get to the concept of an eruv, right? Because we'll get to what an eruv is and how it works, but you're going to have to keep this in mind that there's two different opinions on what Reshut Harabim is.
Rabbi, now, the 600,000 has to be on the street or in the city, in the town. Like, what's the 600,000?
Passing through that area, passing through that domain. So that's a good question, but it seems like in a given day. It seems like it's got to be on a given day.
I don't think there's any street that passes 600,000.
Maybe a New Jersey Turnpike, maybe. I don't know.
Well, I could tell you, I once did a lookup of how many cars go through the Lincoln Tunnel on a given day, right? I figure the Lincoln Tunnel, that's a pretty good one, right? Right. So what do you think the number is?
50,000.
Yeah, when I checked, it was about 60,000, right? So that's the Lincoln Tunnel, right? So it's going to be, the New Jersey Turnpike, right, which is certainly a busy stretch, but most of the cars are going to go through either the Lincoln Tunnel or the Holland Tunnel or the George Washington Bridge, right? So let's say you take 60,000 and you times it by 3, it's 180,000. Even if you double it, right, it's still not 600,000. Now, granted, that's cars, right? And you could argue that since there's more people in the cars, so it starts getting a little more interesting. But you get the sense that to get 600,000 going down a particular street is a lot more complicated. Although I might argue that Times Square, right? How many people pass through Times Square on a given day? I don't know. Why don't we Google it? Lately, not many, but let's
New
see.
New Year's, they say 1 million people are there.
Still not 600.
Right, that's on New Year's, right? Let me go. How many people? That's at one time. How many people pass through?
I'm gonna guess 100,000 a day.
Times Square. I assume they have this information because
150,000.
According to NewYorkCity.go, which is probably a good thing, about 340,000 pedestrians pass through Times Square on a particular day.
Wow.
But that's pedestrians. So it's a good question of whether or not you count the cars, right? Because if you count the cars,
still not going to get to 600.
You're probably not going to get to 600,000.
Right.
Well, I don't know. Actually, cars, you count a bus, right? But the truth is, they cut down a lot of the traffic through Times Square today. So Times Square, which is one of the busier places on earth, right? If I go outside of, we're in New York, right? Which, recently we've come to see what it means to have New York, right? And how that is, and how unique it is, that most other places don't have that, right? So in Israel, is there any place that fits into this kind of thing? Not even close, right? In all of Israel, the whole Jerusalem, is maybe 700,000-800,000 people, Tel Aviv, same. These are not huge places. I don't know. Maybe the only other place that's comparable to New York in this regard are places in China. Whether it be Hong Kong, Tokyo. Those are places that maybe have the population density that we have. Maybe a few. Maybe a couple of places a little, but basically, very few places on Earth have 600,000 people passing through on a given day. Very, very rare. Someone wanted to convince me a couple of years ago that Ocean Parkway had that level of traffic. It does not. Not even close. So it's a huge number, right? And basically, what ends up happening is, depending on the two sides of the argument, is there any place on earth that fits into this category of Reshut Harabim? According to the first opinion, yeah, every street in America does, and according to the second opinion, no, there's very few places, if any, that are Reshut Harabim according to those conditions. So there's these two different opinions. They're both brought in Shulchan Aruch, right? In Shulchan Aruch, it brings the first opinion that I said first, and the second opinion it says, and some say the second opinion of it needs to have 600,000 people in it. So what do we follow, right? So the normal way that we explain in halacha is when you have two opinions brought in Shulchan Aruch, you have an opinion brought without any attribution or without any description, and then you have a second opinion that's brought that says, and some say, we usually follow the first opinion, right? And which in this case is the more strict opinion. So therefore, most Sephardic opinions, most Sephardic rabbis would tell you, follow the first opinion, which is a much more inclusive opinion of what a Reshut Harabim is. And so many places would be considered Reshut Harabim. He says, however, even though that's the normal way that we follow halacha, he says there are many opinions that, and many rabbis who have looked at that second opinion and said, it's okay. That second opinion is the accepted and acceptable opinion. And therefore, even though we normally say that we would follow the first opinion based on the way that it's, it says, it's what we call a stam v'yesh omrim, plain and then ordinary, and then some say. So even though normally we'll follow the ordinary opinion, he says here, and many other rabbis say, since so many people hold the second opinion, if we want to rely on that second opinion, there's plenty to rely upon, and many people do in fact rely on that opinion, and therefore, according to many people, you don't really find a real Reshut Harabim, and that's going to have tremendous impact on how we explain the laws of carrying, which we're going to explain over the next couple of days. Right. So again,
just one question.
Yes.
I'm assuming that the reason that the rabbis ultimately come down with don't look at the 600,000 people is because of practicality. Is that pretty much it?
No, actually, it's really, maybe a little bit, but what's the 600,000, right? So we know that the melacha, right, the melachot that we have, what makes something forbidden is it's the way that it was in the midbar, the way that it was in the wilderness that Bnei Israel were traveling, in terms of building the Mishkan and so on. So basically, the way that we understand the Mishkan was that there was one encampment of which there were 600,000 men of ages 20 to 60, and so since the encampment had all that was the Reshut Harabim, that was the public area. So the question is, does it need to be does that criteria, that last criterion of 600,000, need to be or not? That's really the question. So it's just a dispute as to whether or not that was a necessary criterion or not. Now, obviously, Joe, for practicality, as you point out, it makes a tremendous difference, right? Because if we're going to say that the street that I showed you, which is like any street that we live on, if we're going to say then that's a public domain, that's going to have a major impact on how I deal. Now, I didn't get to the next area, which I'm going to get to, which is depending on how we explain this, will impact, the Reshut Harabim and the Reshut Hayachid, depending on how we explain the Reshut Harabim, will tell us how we explain the next area, which is called the Carmelit, right? Let me start by that now, and then we'll pick up with it tomorrow. He says, Ezahu Carmelit. What is a Carmelit? He says, Makom she'en hiluch l'rabim. It's a place that doesn't have, it's not a public thoroughfare, Kegon Sadeh, like a field, Yam, the sea or river, Bik'ah, a valley, Bekeren Zavit HaSmucha l'Reshut Harabim, a side alleyway, a corner, but Reshut Harabim Mikura, or if it was be a place that otherwise would be public, but it's covered with a ceiling, or things like that. He says that is a Carmelit. A Carmelit ends up being something that is not Reshut HaYachid or not Reshut HaRabim. It is middle ground. It is neither, right? And so Reshut HaRabim, Reshut HaYachid are these two categories, and Carmelit is basically whatever is not in the other two, right? It's kind of the in-between. So depending on how big we make the categories of Reshut HaRabim and Reshut HaYachid will tell us how big, what's considered in a Carmelit, right? So according to the first opinion, right, where Reshut HaRabim is this huge, almost any area, every street in America, and, any outdoor space, so then the Carmelit is really, it's like the wilderness, it's the field, in Iowa, that's a Carmelit, right? But everything else would be Reshut HaRabim, so you wouldn't have so much Carmelit. According to the second opinion, which says in order for you to have Reshut HaRabim, it needs to have 600,000 people. So then there's very few places that have 600,000 people, but there's plenty of places that don't have walls, like my street, right? Every street in America now becomes a Carmelit, right? So you end up having a major difference between these two opinions as to what's the story, right? Are most places Reshut HaRabim, most outdoor places, or are most outdoor places a Carmelit? So that's the dispute between the two opinions. And depending on how you define those two opinions, depending on where we side on those two opinions is going to make a major difference. Because, and I'm going to stop here, carrying in a Reshut HaRabim is asur from the Torah. Carrying in Reshut HaRabim is asur from the Torah. Carrying from Reshut HaYachid to Reshut HaRabim is asur from the Torah. But carrying in a Carmelit is only asur midrabanan. It's only rabbinical. Right? It's not from the Torah. And as we've seen, knowing whether or not something is asur from the Torah or the Drabanan makes a huge difference, not in what I can necessarily do straight up, but if we're talking about what I could do, like let's say letting a goy do it, or let's say there's, doing it in an indirect way, or maybe some other leniencies which will come up, like an eruv we're going to talk about. So it makes a tremendous difference, right? And the first opinion is very restrictive on what the leniencies would be, because it says just about everywhere outside, is considered, I don't say just about everywhere, but lots of public places are considered Reshut HaRabim. Lots of places are like that. And then there's not so many leniencies. Whereas if you follow the second opinion, there's lots and lots of places that are Carmelit, which are only rabbinical in nature, and then we are able to find ways, like an eruv, or letting a non-Jew carry, or something like that, which will create a tremendous amount of leniencies. And that's what we're going to talk about over the next couple of days, is where this comes into play. So we did a lot today, actually. I'm pretty impressed with what we got done. And we're going to pick tomorrow, talking about Makom Petur, and then some other laws about enclosing areas and so on and so forth. And then we'll be able to get into some of the details of what's forbidden or not forbidden. But we accomplished a lot by getting a basic understanding of these areas, Reshut HaRabim, Reshut HaYachid, and the Carmelit. So we'll review it in case you missed anything. But that was a good job today. So Leilui Nishmat Yitzhak ben Bahia, Billy Mizrahi, Alav Shalom. Thank you, Gary, for sponsoring this week's classes.
Baruch.
I'm going to stop the recording here today.